in the sun-baked expanse of Redstone Valley, where the earth cracked under the relentless gaze of the midday sun and the wind whispered secrets through the sparse mesquite bushes. Clara Winslow lived a life marked by solitude and unspoken sorrow. At 32 years old, she was a woman whose presence in the small frontier town evoked a mixture of pity and superstition among its inhabitants. They called her cursed, a label that had clung to her like the dust on her worn boots ever since she had reached marriageable age without a suitor or the blessing of children. Her arms, they said, were empty, barren vessels that fate had deemed unfit to cradle life. Clara's cottage stood on the outskirts of Redstone, a modest structure of weathered adobe and timber, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of years and neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and the flickering light of a single oil lamp cast long shadows across the rough-hewn table where she spent her evenings mending clothes or reading faded pages from an old Bible that had belonged to her mother. Clara's days followed a rhythm as predictable as the rising sun. She rose before dawn, her calloused hands tending to a small garden plot where she coaxed tomatoes, beans, and a few hardy flowers from the arid soil. Water was scarce, drawn from a well that often ran low in the summer months, but Clara managed with a quiet determination that belied the ache in her heart. The townsfolk of Redstone, a collection of ranchers, miners, and shopkeepers who clung to their traditions like lifelines in the vast wilderness, avoided her gaze when she ventured into town for supplies. Mrs. Hargrove at the general store would hand over her flour and salt with a tight-lipped smile, murmuring blessings under her breath as if to ward off whatever ill fortune Claire might carry. The children, wide-eyed and bold, would point and whisper, "That's the cursed lady, her babies all turn to dust before they're born." Clara heard them, every word a needle pricked to her soul, but she never lashed out. Instead, she walked taller, her hazel eyes fixed on the horizon, where the distant mountains promised a world beyond the narrow judgments of Redstone. It hadn't always been this way. Clara remembered a time when she was young and full of promise, the daughter of a respected homesteader who had carved out a life from the unforgiving land. Her father, Elijah Winslow, had been a man of few words but immense strength, teaching her to ride horses and mend fences before she could properly sew a hem. Her mother, Abigail, had filled their home with laughter and stories of far-off cities, her gentle hands guiding Clara through the intricacies of womanhood. But tragedy had struck early. A fever claimed her mother when Clara was 12, and her father followed 5 years later in a mining accident that shook the town to its core. Left alone with the small inheritance and the family land, Clara had expected suitors to come calling, drawn by her quiet beauty and capable nature. Yet, one by one, they turned away as superstitions fueled by a string of misfortunes, a failed engagement when her betrothed died in a cattle stampede, whispers of infertility after she nursed a neighbor's child through illness only for it to perish. The label cursed solidified when, at 25, she buried her last hope, a stillborn child from a brief, ill-fated union with a drifter who vanished before the dust settled. Now, as the spring of 1887 bloomed tentatively across the valley, Clara found solace in small rituals. She would sit on her porch at dusk, watching the stars emerge like pinpricks in a velvet sky, her fingers idly tracing patterns on the arm of her rocking chair. The chair had been her mother's, carved by her father as a wedding gift, and it creaked softly under her weight, a comforting echo of lost voices. Loneliness was her constant companion, but Clara had learned to embrace it, turning inward to a well of resilience that surprised even her. She sewed dresses for the wealthier women in town, Mrs. Caldwell, the banker's wife, or the daughters of the ranch owner, her stitches precise and elegant, transforming plain calico into garments that whispered of grace. Payment came in coins or barter, enough to sustain her, but never enough to fill the void. On Sundays, she attended the little white church on the hill, sitting in the back pew, her voice joining the hymns with a purity that made the congregation shift uncomfortably. Reverend Harlan would preach of redemption and family, his eyes skimming over her as if she were a reminder of divine displeasure. One fateful afternoon, as Clara knelt in her garden pulling weeds that threatened her budding tomatoes, the sound of hooves echoed down the dirt road leading into Redstone. She glanced up, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, and saw a rider approaching. He was a stranger, tall in the saddle, his broad-brimmed hat casting a shadow over a face lined by sun and hardship. His horse, a bay mare with the white blaze on her forehead, moved with a weary grace, kicking up puffs of dust that danced in the hot air. The man dismounted outside the saloon in town, but Clara could see him from her vantage point, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He tied his horse to the hitching post and stretched, revealing a lean, muscular frame clad in faded denim and a leather vest. Something about him stirred a curiosity in Clara she hadn't felt in years, a quiet intensity that seemed out of place in the sleepy town. The stranger's name was Eli Tanner, though Clara wouldn't learn it until later that evening. He had ridden in from the north, following the cattle trails that wound through the territories, a cowboy by trade but a wanderer by nature. At 35, Eli had seen more of the world than most in Redstone could imagine: the bustling streets of Denver, the lawless saloons of Tombstone, the endless plains of Kansas where buffalo once roamed in thunderous herds. His life had been one of constant motion, herding cattle for ranchers who paid in silver and stories, dodging outlaws and storms with equal aplomb. But beneath his rugged exterior lay a heart scarred by loss. Eli had once been married to a woman named Sarah in a small town near the Rio Grande. They had dreamed of a family, of building a homestead where children could run free. But Sarah had died in childbirth, taking their son with her, and Eli had fled the pain, burying it under miles of trail dust and the solitude of starry nights. Redstone was meant to be a brief stop for Eli, a place to rest his horse, stock up on provisions, and perhaps find work on one of the nearby ranches. He entered the saloon, the swinging doors creaking as he pushed them open, and ordered a whiskey from the barkeep, a grizzled man named Zeke who eyed him suspiciously. "What brings you to Redstone, stranger?" Zeke asked, sliding the glass across the scarred bar top. Eli took a sip, the liquid burning a familiar path down his throat. "Just passing through," he replied, his voice low and gravelly, carrying the faint drawl of the southern plains. But as he sat there, nursing his drink, the locals began to trickle in, the conversations a murmur of daily gripes and tall tales. It wasn't long before talk turned to Clara. "That Winslow woman," one ranch hand muttered, leaning against the bar. "Cursed as they come. Stay clear if you know what's good for you." Eli's ears perked up, though he kept his gaze on his glass. "Cursed how?" he asked casually, not looking up. The ranch hand chuckled darkly. "Empty arms, that's how. No man, no kids. Folks say she's got the devil's mark on her soul. Last fella who courted her ended up 6 feet under." The others nodded in agreement, spinning yarns of misfortune that followed Clara like a shadow. Eli listened without comment, but the spark of intrigue ignited within him. He had known curse as a real once, born of grief and regret, and this sounded more like small-town cruelty than supernatural wrath. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, Eli stepped outside, the cool evening breeze a relief after the stuffy saloon. He untied his horse and led her toward the livery stable, but his path took him past Clara's cottage. She was on her porch, hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 posts, her movements graceful despite the mundane task. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and Eli tipped his hat, a gesture of politeness that made Clara pause. She nodded in return, her heart skipping a beat at the stranger's steady gaze. He didn't linger, but as he walked away, Eli couldn't shake the image of Hera alone but in bowed, her hazel eyes holding a depth that mirrored his own hidden pains. The next morning, Eli rose early, the livery stable's hay-scented air filling his lungs as he saddled his mare. He had secured a job at the Double Bar Ranch, 10 miles out of town, herding cattle for the season. But before heading out, he rode into Redstone proper, stopping at the general store for coffee and jerky. Clara was there, bargaining for thread with Mrs. Hargrove. Their paths crossed again, this time in the cramped aisle lined with sacks of flour. "Mornin', ma'am," Eli said, his voice warm like the first light of day. Clara turned, surprised, and managed a soft good morning. Mrs. Hargrove watched with raised eyebrows, but Eli paid her no mind. "Name's Eli Tanner," he introduced himself, extending a hand. Clara hesitated, then shook it, her skin tingling at the contact. "Clara Winslow," she replied, her voice steady though her pulse raced. From that moment, Eli found excuses to return to town more often than necessary. He would buy supplies he didn't need, linger near the church after services, or even help with odd jobs around Redstone, fixing a fence for the widow Jenkins or hauling water for the schoolhouse. Each time, he sought out Clara, their conversations starting small: the weather, the price of grain, the beauty of the valley's wildflowers. But gradually, they deepened. One afternoon, as Claire weeded her garden, Eli rode by undismounted, offering to help. "Ain't no trouble," he said, kneeling beside her in the dirt. They worked in companionable silence for a while, until Clara asked, "What brings a man like you to a place like this?" Eli paused, his hands caked in soil. "Looking for something I lost, I reckon. Peace, maybe, or a reason to stay put." Clara shared bits of her story too, haltingly at first: to the loss of her parents, the failed dreams, the weight of the town's judgment. Eli listened without interruption, his storm cloud eyes reflecting understanding. "Folks fear what they don't know," he said finally. "But you ain't cursed, Clara. You're surviving. That's more than most can claim." His words were a balm, easing the knots in her chest she hadn't realized were there. As days turned to weeks, their encounters became the highlight of Clara's routine. Eli would bring her small gifts: a wildflower bouquet, a polished stone from the riverbed, and in return, she mended his torn shirt or shared a meal of fresh bread and stew. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Whispers grew into outright gossip that Cowboy's courting the cursed woman, they said in the saloon and at the market. "He'll regret it, mark my words." Reverend Harlan even pulled Eli aside after church one Sunday, warning him of Clara's afflictions. But Eli shrugged it off. Respectfully, "Reverend, I make my own judgments." His resolve only strengthened when he saw how the words wounded Clara. One evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset, she confessed, "They're right, you know. My arms are empty. Always have been." Eli turned to her, his hand covering hers. "Empty don't mean broken. And if you'll have me, Clara, my arms are yours, forever." Those words hung in the air like a promise, igniting a hope Clara had long buried. But as their bond deepened, shadows from the past began to stir. Eli's old life caught up in the form of a letter from a former partner, hinting at unfinished business on the trails. And in Redstone, jealousy and fear brewed among those who couldn't understand why a man like Eli would choose the cursed woman. Little did they know, the true test of their connection was just beginning, as a drought gripped the valley, testing faiths and forcing secrets into the light.